So welcome everyone. It's February, and I was just going to say, keep your chins up like me because it's almost spring. Soon the light will be better in the morning and the evenings. We'll be able to go for walks, and the birds will be singing in the trees with the dawn chorus. And not so long ago, we were diving, and we'll be diving again soon. Hopefully around April and May. Let's see what happens. But great to see so many of you online again. I've got a couple of announcements before we go into the competition. Has anyone got anything they would like to say before I give my two announcements out? Anyone at all? No? Bit of a train noise. No. Okay, so the two announcements I have. The first one is about the BRUPC, the British and Irish Underwater Photographic Competition. Is going to be on the 4th of September this year. So that's the date for your diary. I am taking over the organising with Joss and Sarah White on the day. So all the marketing, the advertising will come from myself. Paul Colley, after having done it for many years, will be taking part this year. So it's the 4th of September. The other thing is I've been in contact with Nigel Eaton, who runs the dive show, the diver print competition, or he's part of it in the NEC. He has got a provisional date for October where he would like to run the competition and the show. The NEC dive show, if it goes ahead, will be the 30th and the 31st of October, but don't book anything yet because things might change. What it means for myself and Charles Erb, who has taken over from Trevor, is that we'll have to look to getting the organising of the print competition sorted out in case it does go ahead. But those are the provisional dates, 30th and the 31st for the dive show at the NEC if it goes ahead. So that's all I've got to say. On that note, Paul, would we like to start the competition? This month's competition, the theme is black and white. And the definition is an image in shades of only black and white. And this month's judge is Henley Spiers. And again, we've had a bumper number of entries, I think because of the interest drummed up on Facebook, which is fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for being involved. We have 54 entries this month.
Well, it takes so much longer than the last time I did this. 54 entries is really good to see, and I think that's been pretty consistent. One of the weird silver linings of this COVID era seems to be that the monthly competitions are getting far more engagement and entries, which is really good to see. It also meant I had my work to cut out. You know, there's lots of very different style of imagery, different subjects there. So as always, I enjoyed looking at underwater imagery, as we all do, and I enjoyed thinking about which ones were my personal favorites and why. I've written up feedback for all 54 entries, which is something I've been fortunate enough. Thanks, by the way, Rob, for inviting me to judge Black and White. I've always tried to provide feedback on every image entered, because I think, you know, actually that's the benefit is not just to the top 6. It's actually perhaps far more to those who weren't in the top 6. So Rob has that. I'm happy to share it on Facebook, and I think whilst the website is still under construction, we need to be a little bit creative about how that comes out. So maybe Nick and Rob can come up with a good way to share that. And I've also been thinking about these competitions, and one of the things which I did was started by Laura Storm, which was this sort of judges pre-comments in terms of engaging people with how I or any judge is going to think about this category and some of sort of what inspires us about it. And I think that's a really healthy conversation for us to have. And the more I think about it, these monthly competitions should be about, it shouldn't really be about the winners. And I know that's easy to say, but I think this is a community and this is a society. And I'd really encourage you, yes, I have picked out my personal favorites, and if you're amongst them, well done, congratulations. But if you're not, don't get too caught up in that. I would really hope that we can look at the other images and see what inspires us, and then look at our own imagery and think about, well, is there anything that I would do differently if given the opportunity? And we use the monthly competitions as a way of sharing information, sharing inspiration. And that's kind of what I've gone into this. So whilst we're going to look at the winners, if you're not amongst them, don't sweat it. Just look at it, see if you agree, and see what you can take from it. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, so with 54 entries, I wasn't too shy about commending entries. Oh, Kirsty, well done. I mean, this one, it's such a classy shot, both in terms of how it was captured in camera and the post-processing. Yeah, it's sort of irresistible. And yet I've seen lots of blue sharks, and even despite all of that, you know, it does jump out at me. It is beautiful, and it's only commended rather than in the sort of top 6 for me on this occasion, because I had talked about, I was really looking for originality, things that I hadn't seen before. So that's what held this one back. Congratulations, Simon. I mean, it's just classically beautiful, this shot. And there were 2 of these anemones entered, and one of them was inverted. And I was wrestling a bit with whether I prefer the sort of the more natural rendition like this or the inverted one. And I almost like the idea of having one inverted and one like this as sort of fine art prints to put up in a home. You could easily invert this shot and see what it gives. I mean, it's beautifully captured. It's a stunning subject, British too, which is always nice, as well as the blue shark. Have I seen it done before? Yes. So again, like with the blue shark, although it is really beautiful and well done, That's what held it back from the top 6 finish. There's a slight difference in tonality in this one. It's sort of slightly more bluish hued black and white, and that changes the feeling. And so now we have this kind of cool eel in this shot. It's very beautiful work with the lighting, the backlighting, and yet we still have that eye. We feel, I think, in monochrome, those teeth, that little bit more, that texture is kind of what pops out more, I think. So yeah, I mean, a fantastic portrait. Again, really classy work. Have I seen it before? Yes. So again, that's why it's commended rather than toxic. Yeah, a very different type of image here. This one, you know, I'm naturally drawn to very graphic, sort of minimalist, high impact, black and white, high contrast, which this shot isn't. And yet it really spoke to me, and maybe it speaks to me even more right now when we're all stuck. Because, you know, 3 tiger sharks, what I wouldn't give to be in that spot right now. And you know, I feel a bit of a connection with each of the 3 individuals in the shot, and it just makes me want to be there. So yeah, beautifully done. Well done, Becky. Right, yeah. So this one, it just jumps straight out at you. And it's so much, one of the other things I talked about is consider whether your shot is better in black and white or color. And I think this one, it has more power as just a simple monochrome like this. And it really just, it hits you in the face. It actually doesn't matter that the focus is on the snout rather than the eyes, because it's this sort of fine art, abstract, underwater shot. In fact, you might not even be sure what you're looking at, but you like it. I mean, we're familiar with this environment, so we do know what we're looking at. But yeah, really effective. I think even that square crop, it just helps to kind of to concentrate our attention, bring us into this, this sort of slightly surreal image. So yeah, well done. Yeah. I had an inkling that might be you, Nick. I wasn't sure if it was you here or the blue shark. Not that that matters, it's just you start to get a feel for some people's style. I really like the way that fin sort of splits the light and the dark areas of the shot. And there were 3 turtle entries in the competition, and this was the standout one. I've gone into the reasons why the others don't work for me in the general feedback, which we'll send out. But yeah, I think the eye contact, that sort of dark to light shift, it really, really works. For me, my personal frustration with this one, and what I think could elevate it further, is you see this sort of bottom right-hand corner area. If I was trying the edit, I would probably try and have that really dark too. And then I think I might feel even more graphic impact of the shot. Maybe I don't know if you would completely lose that cleaner out or not. I don't think the shot is about a cleaning behavior anyway for me. It's about beauty. It's about my connection with this turtle. So that'd be something I'd be curious to see. Ooh. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this one, I love it. Again, kind of like Nick's shot, we have this interplay between 2 halves of an image, the light and the dark, which is actually what black and white is all about. And so whilst I enjoy the visual representation of, all right, this is dark and this is light, and that's probably what hits me first, then I start to see the modular rays and all the detail within that, and then I understand the freediver, and I understand the connection between all the elements in the image. And so it kind of hits you with its contrast, and then everything gets drawn together. What's a fault? I mean, you know, you're being pressed to think critically about images when you're picking between them. So for me, is it a little bit soft? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you've had to push your settings pretty hard to shoot straight down on this scene of fast-moving animals. So yeah, I think, and then when you're doing these high contrast edits, again, you're pushing the file quite hard. So I think I feel a little bit of that, maybe a touch of softness, but I love it. So that's the key message. The top three, I could have picked any one and been really happy with it. For me, there were three shots which really, any one of those could have been the winner. So Dan, you know, consider yourself first quite happily, no problem. This shot, you'd think that with a colorful, I think this is an emperor angelfish, you think that you would suffer by taking away its color. And yet we really don't in this image. And it just oozes a kind of vintage class. The feel of it, for me, is like some kind of like high fashion celebrity portrait is the feel. Like, you know, I could see Paul Newman's face in this style somehow, this style of edit. I think it's a really very classy image and edit. And yet what we're looking at is a small fish and a bit of a bigger fish, which on its own, it shouldn't be that much, but it has huge impact. I think it's really gorgeous. The lines, the texture from the scales, the interplay of the two fish. I think it's great. Really well done. I wish it was my shot. Rob. Okay, I promise I didn't know this was Rob's shot until now. One of the really rewarding things, it wasn't my aim, but one of the rewarding things was actually that top three. Two of the shots were taken in Britain, and this is one of them. And I guess you could say the top two is all Britain. And this is, I mean, I love seeing birds underwater. I think that's always fascinating. And yet here in black and white, you couldn't really design a better composition. I might crop in just a little bit on the left, top left. I might come in just a tiny bit. But aside from that, we have this this bird with its white body against the dark portion of the image. Then where Snell's window starts to kick in, we've got this dark, the dark wing with this superbly angular shape. And then on top of that, we've got these three perfectly placed silhouettes where we can tell exactly what it is, and they're all, you know, they're all looking fantastic. It's a marvelous image. I really enjoy it, and St. Abs has just climbed right up on my charts of places to go to next. All right. Oh. Okay, congratulations, Rick. Yeah, I mean, it just hits you hard, this shot. And I think these isopods are kind of weirdly beautiful, but I've personally only ever seen them in color. So, and I think they really suit this monochrome treatment. You know, those sort of those lines, those, you know, kind of like zebra-like lines on a white background, which I think adds that originality. You know, it's one thing to get the black backgrounds, great, we enjoy those, but we see a lot of them. I think white backgrounds are maybe a little underused, a little sort of they're harder to achieve. And I do actually have just out of personal interest a question around whether this was achieved purely with general edits or whether there's kind of some localized or some positive vignetting to help achieve this effect, just out of curiosity. But I mean, it's just a graphically very powerful image, which also has enough detail to kind of to draw you in and to wonder what this is. I mean, we kind of know what this is, but I suppose if you didn't know what it is, you might wonder where the front and the back is and all of this. But, you know, I think it's phenomenal that this tiny macro subject is something in this rendition that I would quite happily put up on my wall as a fine art print. So, yeah, very well done. Love your work. Congratulations.
Thanks, Henley. So for next month, it's the theme portfolio judge not yet decided. Nick, back to you.
I was just going to say thank you everyone for taking the time to enter this month. I think there have been some lovely images, and thank you, Henley, for taking so much care in the judging and also in the run-up again on Facebook. Very, very, very happy for those who've placed, and congratulations to all of you. And I agree with Henley, you know, in terms of actually the competition, you know, it's about everyone who entered really, and it's like, you know, everyone should get something out of it. I think moving forward, that's another piece of work, another kind of like iteration of the cycle about encouraging people to enter competitions, and I would value people's ideas on that really. And creativity about taking that forward. Facebook seems to be a creative hub at the moment, doesn't it? So, Henley, you're back in the UK now, aren't you? For a bit, or have you got plans? I take COVID's basically brought you back. I take it. And
actually, no. It was the plan. It just
okay.
That to be quite fortuitous. So we moved back about January last year, back to Exeter, which was a sort of a decision. Jade was pregnant with our second child at the time. It was a kind of a family decision, with the idea being that we would travel for work as necessary, which hasn't really happened. But no, we're back for good, Nick.
But no plans to get into a collar and a tie anytime yet, I hope. Going like myself.
A long time ago.
Yeah. Oh, well, good stuff. Thank you very much. So we now have the main presentation of the evening, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce John Collins. John, I don't know if you've got your webcam, and you have, haven't you? You're there. Okay, so you've got your webcam. Yes, a webcam, and we can hear you as well. That's fantastic. So to introduce John and I had a session on a weekend a couple of weekends ago, and we had about, I think, 45 minutes, and it was quite absorbing talking to you, John. John started diving in 1984. He was a marine scientist, and I believe that he did his training at Trinity College Dublin. So he's got a long history of diving, so great experience. And he started taking underwater photographs in the film days. So he was saying to me that he started off with a Nikon 5 and went on to Subao, Nikon film cameras, and eventually ended up with digital SLR. What John is going to talk to us about tonight is why he is now using a smaller camera. I think it's a Micro Four Thirds. Is that right, John?
Yeah, that's it.
And the benefits of doing such things. And so on that note, I think the only other thing that I'd like to say about you, I'm very jealous, is that you live on the south coast of Ireland in a place called Kinsale, which you compared to being like St Ives in Cornwall.
Well,
so
I'll make you a little bit more jealous in a minute when I show you some photographs of it.
Yeah, okay. So Paul, if you could make John presenter, please.
Yeah, just coming up. So John, good to see you, John. It's been a while.
And you, Paul?
I'm just going to make you presenter.
Okay.
And
so I just hit my screen then to share, right?
Sorry, say again?
I just have a screen button then to share, right?
Yes, the screen button. We're seeing you now, John. That's great.
Yeah, great stuff.
So you get to see that, right?
Yeah.
Great. So thanks very much, Nick and Paul and everybody. Delighted to do a presentation for you. Nick and I chatted about a couple of topics, but Nick felt that this would be of interest to the majority of people. I suppose people, like all of us, are slow to change our equipment, you know, when we grow it to a certain point and we get comfortable in the way things work, and consistency is so important. So we figured this topic would be of interest. So Nick's done some introductions there. I'm not a marine scientist, by the way. I learned to dive with marine scientists. I studied pharmacy, so I'm in healthcare, but I learned an awful lot from diving with zoologists in Trinity. And you know, it really does set you on your way of, I suppose, understanding what you're seeing, and it adds to the intrigue when you're a wide-eyed, wet behind the ears, you know, new open water student. So you've read the introduction, and I'm sure I'm not going to spend any time on it, but I have to give the book its slide. It always has to squeeze in there. It was a nice project to do, and it's really interesting still to bring cold waters to a non-diving audience. And I would encourage you all to kind of keep doing that, because many people believe all that's down there is brown seaweed and nothing else. And people are genuinely amazed when they see, you know, and hear the stories of what is in our waters. I've quite diverse interests in photography over recent years. I shoot analog still. This is my last book, which was just black and white. It was more a kind of a concept book, and I'm getting a bit more normal at this stage. I did come across this slide in my digging around. The first article I had published was by Peter Rowlands when Underwater Photography magazine became Sport Diver, and this was in 1990. That was the first thing I'd ever published. You're kind of slightly cringy now when you look at it, but it gets you going. This is the recent issue of Ireland's Subsea magazine, which I had a feature in, and this is a little bit relevant, even though it's just a shot taken with my phone, but it is of a double-page spread. So when we come to talking about smaller formats and, you know, do they have the muscle to do what you need to do, that will become a little bit relevant. It's really nice to put your work out there in different ways as well, and I particularly like reaching non-diving audiences, so it's really good to exhibit. I like to engage in, we have a very active arts scene here in Kinsale. There's an arts week every year, and last year, because everything was closed, I had an idea to take over a travel agents, which was an interesting project. If you ever pass a travel agents and you see these backlit or LED lit panels that they put, you know, all their offers on, and of course there was nothing going on, so I approached them and I said, can I have your place for 3 weeks coming up to the Arts Week? And basically using theatre lighting and using tiled images, we basically brought it underwater, and it was really, it got a lot of engagement. Because the whole street was blue in the evening when it shined across, and there was an audio, there was a soundscape. So if you go on the web page for it, you'll get the sound as well if your sound is on. So, oops, I skipped one there. When I was kind of doing my little whiteboard as to what I might talk about, I said, you know what, we're all stuck at home in our armchairs. And as Nick said, I am lucky enough to live somewhere very nice. It's not terribly nice at the moment, I have to tell you, but it is generally very nice. And I said I'd give you a whirlwind tour of Kinsale, just for a bit of armchair travel, because that's all we're all going to be doing for the foreseeable future. If you haven't been we are on Ireland's south coast, 20 kilometres or so south of Cork City, and it's the beginning of what a tourist initiative now calls the Wild Atlantic Way, which is quite a well signposted, I suppose, a road trip really, all along the western seaboard. So starting in Kinsale and ending up in Donegal. This is an aerial shot that shows you kind of the heart of the town, which is the harbour, the Bandon River. And we have a couple of marinas, and it's, I suppose, centred around that really is the harbour life. You know, and through the seasons, it's always just an interesting place to be. The harbour itself is back in here where we've just been, and I suppose our area is really dominated by this very long headland, long peninsula called the Old Head of Kinsale, which is dominated by this lighthouse that you see out in the end. This is a proper helicopter aerial, none of your drone stuff here from quite a few years ago. And I'm going to show you some photographs from around here. So this is the very tip of the head itself. This area called Bream Rock is a very nice dive. We have some lovely dives all through there, which are generally sheltered from the southwest. And when the wind turns and we get weather from the east or southeast, this little cove in here has extremely nice diving, and I'll share some of those with you as well. The tip of that kind of brings you more or less 5 miles offshore. So often we'll get some visits from megafauna. And as you'll know, as underwater photographers, the basking shark will always turn away from you at the very last moment. So they're always tricky. The Old Head is also, I suppose, very much associated with the wreck of the Lusitania. So there's been many technical diving expeditions over the years. This is actually quite a rare photograph, and it's in the Liverpool Maritime Museum, shot in 1911, and this is the Old Head. The lighthouse is just cropped out of it, but this is Lusitania passing the Old Head in 1911. The Lusitania is 100 meters deep, so it's not a normal dive, but we have lots of shallower and more interesting dives. This is on the west side of the Old Head. It's a very broken up wreck now called the City of Chicago, which steamed straight into the Old Head in 1892. And that's a very pleasant kind of 15 to 18 meter dive in generally nice conditions. So that's a nice one. We've quite a few wrecks around Cork Harbour. This one is of a World War I mine-laying U-boat called UC-42. So nice variety of dives, and you know, whether it's scenic or wreck. We're also lucky to have a dive centre based in the town called Ocean Addicts. So if you ever are coming this way, they're the guys to look up. They've been on the go for 10 years and they know what they're doing, so I can recommend them. Photographers do enjoy coming here. This is Dutch photographer René Lux, who came a few years ago, and I spent a few dives with him, and it was after a very heavy winter of storms, and one of the caves on the west, or one of the kind of gullies on the west side of the Old Head, was littered with golf balls, which exposed the very posh golf course on the Old Head for the slack golfers. They're obviously putting as many balls into the sea as they are putting it around their various greens. So that was a bit of fun. So Micro Four Thirds is what I'm going to talk about, and it is, as Nick said, a different format, a smaller format. Some of you might be familiar with it, some won't, so I'll assume that you don't have a whole lot of knowledge about it. I've been interested in smaller format cameras, I suppose always. I like rangefinders, I like Leica M's, particularly for travel, when my kids were small, when you'd be trying to keep weight down. And I bought one of the early Micro Four Thirds cameras, which was an Olympus EP2, and was immediately attracted by the size of the camera. and it was quite capable, although it didn't have a viewfinder. So it was still, you know, a compact style camera where you were holding it at arm's length, which feels completely unnatural to me in using a camera. So the big difference really is that these cameras are smaller. It's a smaller format than full frame. This is actually a full frame film camera, a Nikon F6 beside it, but that would be a similar size to, say, a Nikon D810 or 750, something like that. So you can see that the camera is very significantly smaller, and so the sensor is smaller. It's actually half the size. And it was designed from the ground up as a digital format, starting off as what was called the original 4/3 format, which was an optical DSLR designed by Olympus. They then partnered with Panasonic in 2008, and they brought out the first, I suppose, mirrorless cameras. So the big differences to what you're used to either in full frame or APS-C is that the ratio is a 4:3 ratio rather than a 3:2. So that means the images are a little bit more square than what you're used to. I personally like that. Some people may not. The crop factor, if you think of that in full frame or 35mm terms, is ×2. So an 8mm fisheye lens on Micro Four Thirds is the same as your 16mm fisheye on full frame, and so on. So you kind of have to get your head around that initially to understand the optics and what's going on. One of the other big things that came in with these cameras, and it was originally an Olympus innovation, was in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, which I'm sure, you know, we're all looking at nowadays because it fits in with so many of the manufacturers. And now, as it has kind of progressed through its generations, it is remarkably good. You know, on the Olympus, if you have a matching body and lens, you know, they will claim over 7 stops of steadiness that can be put back in, which is quite remarkable. These formats, this particular format and these cameras are also excellent for video. And we might talk a little bit about the future of Micro Four Thirds towards the end, but I feel that will be the future of this format, because many things are changing in the photographic world, and it does work very well for that. I'll show you a little example of that later on also. So why is it good for underwater photography? Well, the main thing is when it's a smaller format, it's a smaller rig. And it's not just that the camera body itself is smaller. When the optics become smaller, everything starts to shrink. So if you take, for example, a mirrorless modern camera like one of the Sonys, which have become really popular, you'll find that the body will shrink without the optical viewfinder, but still the overall bulk of the camera remains the same because the lenses are still the same, they're large. So the real win is in the optics, to my eye, with the Micro Four Thirds format. And then everything else shrinks. So the housing gets a little bit smaller, the domes get a little bit smaller because the optics are simpler, and overall you have a tidier system. When you get used to that, and I think this has been the big thing for me, is it would be very difficult for me personally to go back to what I was using before that, which were pro bodies in Subal housing. So Nikon D2s and D3s and Subal housings are enormous compared to an Olympus EM1, for example, in an Nauticam housing that I'm currently using is just so much tidier. So this is a huge advantage for travel whenever we do ever to get back on a plane again. And to give you an idea of what I can pack in my little rolly soft bag, so it doesn't look very heavy, of course it is, but we don't tell anybody that. And in this, we have a housing, camera and lens, 2 strobes, port, a wet lens, and pretty much everything else. It really does make traveling with all of your equipment, except for arms and clamps, really, that's the only thing that goes in the hold. Everything else you can carry by hand, which is a big plus, and it's, you know, it's not a backbreaker to roll around with it. Of course, when we put it all together, it does become large. So, you know, when you add the handles back on, the clamps, the arms, the strobes, and all the other bits and pieces, of course it ends up being a large rig by the time we get to put it underwater. So, you know, you may not find that the overall system is smaller, but the housing itself is. What I've pictured here is, this is using water contact optics, which we might talk a little bit more about later. So this is a wet lens that has zoomed through. It's a Nauticam WWL1, and this is a diopter. So with a single kit lens, so in here is a 14 to 42 inexpensive kit lens, which makes, with the water contact optics, becomes a much better the lens underwater because it has been so well corrected by the optics. Just another angle on that. These lenses are very attractive, and they've been a great innovation from Nauticam, but they are very heavy. So now with this one, I had a buoyancy collar put on. Now they're building the buoyancy collars into them, which does make them a lot better. And then, of course, if you want enhanced viewfinding, you can add, I prefer a 180, some people prefer the 45s, but for wide angle, for fisheye, I don't put any viewfinder on, I just swap it out. It's an easy swap out. So this is what it looks like underwater. This is a shot taken by my buddy Graham Ferguson of Oceanetics on the last time I was abroad, which was Cape Verde in late 2019. So on this, we have a 170mm dome and an 8mm fisheye. That's as big as it gets for me now. And, you know, again, very simple kind of flotation. I love having neutrally weighted rig underwater. When I let that go, as that setup sits there, it just floats in front of me. I really like getting that neutral, and I think it makes driving it underwater really easy. There's a few images from the first season I used this, which was the original OMD EM1, and straight off the bat it was remarkable. I thought it was really sharp to use, really tidy. It did struggle in a couple of areas initially. One was autofocus, which the second generation completely fixed really to my eye. So on one trip in particular to the Azores, distant subjects like this, which don't have a lot of contrast, the autofocus would hunt, but eventually I just turned it off and manually focused and got on with it. So, you know, it's certainly not ideal, but I think they have got so much better now, and I don't worry about it anymore. I wrote about the Mark II version of the EM1, and this is what Olympus picked up on. It's an interesting feature if you like to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of why the camera is good and the areas that they really improved on. And one was its dynamic range, first of all, which for landscape is much bigger deal because we're trying to pull so much more information out of the shadows. And if you go onto that blog post, as you scroll down, you'll see a sort of before and after of a couple of images that are super dark shadows that lifted quite easily and were, you know, very printable and usable afterwards. So once I got my hands on this camera and began to use it, really it was starting to tick all of the boxes I needed. And at that point I sold my full frame stuff, and I only use that as my digital rig now. So my setup at the moment is just 3 lenses. My favorite is the 8mm fisheye. I love wide angle. In that shot there is again by Graham, shot just last year. I was shooting video on that one, so there's just they're actually 2 little light and motion solar lights, so they're focus lights really. And that's a really nice lens. It's an 8mm Olympus lens and a 170mm Zen dome, really sharp, tidy. The wet lens system is really, it's a game changer. When you can use a tiny lens, let me show you on that. So that's a little kit lens with a zoom gear that goes in the housing behind a very narrow port, and then the water contact optic goes on that. It's zoomed through, so at its wide end, which, you know, is a 24mm equivalent, we say, as a land lens, but with the water contact optics, it now stretches to a 130-degree wide angle lens. Being able to zoom through is really great, and being able to change that off, even though it's heavy and clunky, you can take it off, and you could, you know, if you had a macro moment that you couldn't resist, you still have the long end of that zoom if you want to use it. So that's kind of, you know, if you're jumping into something and you have no idea what's going to be in there, that's my kind of go-to. And then if I deliberately want to shoot macro, my favorite lens for that is the 60. It's a little bit long for green water here, but I just like it and I've gotten used to it. So I've tried several other combinations. I found a couple of old pictures. This is a really good lens, particularly for landscape. It's an Olympus 7-14 f2.8. So again, a professional spec lens, an expensive lens, very sharp rectilinear lens. But as we know, with all of these rectilinear lenses, they're devils to get sharp in the corners, and you need large domes and spacers. And it actually ended up being a really heavy, awkward rig to use. And really, when the water contact optics came around, it beats it out of the park. It's sharper, it's better, you know, and it's much tighter. That's a direct comparison. So that's the wet lens with the buoyancy color, the sort of styrofoam buoyancy color, which has now been replaced by one, as I say, that's built in. So just a few images. These are just from last season. They're out of camera JPEGs, which, you know, when somebody asks you to do a presentation like this, and you realize, oh my God, I've like 2 folders of images that I haven't even edited yet. So these were from last summer, which it was great just to get in the water, and we were so lucky that we got a few weeks of diving. Things opened up in early July. Oceanetics operated until September, and we had some decent days where we were able to get out and about around the Old Head and just get in the water. So it was great. I primarily used the 8mm with the dome for that. It was just what I felt like doing at the time. This is that western side of the Old Head, if you remember that aerial shot of the lighthouse. And when that goes calm, it's a particularly nice area to dive. I've used the EM1 Mark II on one foreign trip, and it was terrific for that. This was in Raja Ampat in late 2017. Again, just terrific to travel with, mostly wide angle. I did some macro, but I don't have the patience that many of you have for doing particularly the super macro. For these tiny little guys where you're trying to shoot this and use a snoot, I use the Retra strobes. Now I've used Inons for years, and that one is taken with the fill light behind from a diffused one of flash on the left, and then the snoot, or the LSD as Retra call it, on the main one. But they're just so hard. I find it more increasingly difficult to sit down and do that hard macro. So I prefer the kind of the freedom of the wide stuff, and just selectively lighting those scenes is what kind of floats my boat. This is with the water contact optic. Again, you can see that it's super corner sharp, and it is really a very nice system to use. That was Cape Verde. If anybody's ever been there, it's sort of like the Canary Islands with more fish and a little bit more color on the rocks. It's not dramatic, or it's not the Red Sea, but it was a very nice place to visit, and we'd be very happy to visit it again. It's again an in-water shot. It's not very clear. It's shot by another friend, but you can see the size of the overall camera is very tidy on you as a diver underwater. I've also got an Inon Super Bug Eye lens, it's called, and I've found a way of making that reasonably sharp and using it as a circular fisheye with that zoom. You find a little sweet spot where it'll work, so I'll swap that out, and it's such a tiny lens that it works quite well, and it's a bit of fun, it's something different. I did mention video, and I'm not a video guy by any stretch, but I do enjoy shooting video from time to time. And just last week, we have an environmental program on RTE, our national broadcaster, and they came down last summer to do a piece on the marine environment. And while they didn't get great conditions for shooting on the day where we were filming their presenter underwater, I gave them some stock footage which I had shot with the Micro Four Thirds format, and they were quite happy to use it, and they broadcast it. If this works, I'll give you a quick look at some of that. I don't think you'll get audio, but you'll get, I'll just let a few seconds of it play. This was in 2014, so this was with the original version of the Olympus EM1. It's just shot on HD, it's not 4K. But I was interested when that crew came, and I was asking them what did they want, did they need 4K, and they actually didn't. They preferred HD at 50 frames because editing was easier, managing the footage, and it was certainly quality enough for normal broadcast. So I thought that was interesting, given how everything has driven, you know, towards everything must be 4K now, and the latest cameras are even 8K. I don't even know what that means really. We're going to have to take out whole walls of our rooms and put in TVs that size. So certainly the video quality from Micro Four Thirds is really good. Panasonic would be seen to be the leaders in that area, but I think the Olympus cameras, recent cameras, have really caught up, and I don't think any video person would find a huge difference between them. So then we come to the But John questions, and I'm going to allow you to kind of fire them at me, but I think the typical But John sort of questions on this is, it's only got 20 megapixels. The other question is, haven't Olympus gone bust, John? It's not as good as full frame, and any other questions that I'm sure some of you will come to mind. So let me address one or two of them that have come up from me. When the original EM1 came out, I started shooting it, you know, on land as well as underwater. And at the time, I was doing some work on a hospital commission, and one of the images they wanted was this nice wide-angle image of an area just outside Kinsale called Sandy Cove, but it was shot with an EM1, and it was, you know, quite a modest file. And I said, I don't think it has the res to be printed large. So this is an 800mm print, so it's quite large when you see it on the corridor. And I gave it to my local Studio One framer, and he prints big. And he had very little to do to the print, and it's absolutely perfect when you see it enlarged that size. So that didn't really bother me. A separate commission was for some large panoramics, again for a hospital. This one was in Clonakilty. This beautiful beach is in an area called Inchydoney, which is further west in West Cork. And they had a particular area where they wanted this, and they wanted it very large. So this print needed to be over 2 meters long, which the camera didn't have. But I used a nodal slide and the Olympus and shot vertical images for stitching, and it turned out absolutely fine. It's actually a really nice print. Similarly, for something large, I had this idea of doing this 5-panel pieces, which are in a local gallery. They're about 1.65 or 70 across. And again, the original image didn't have the res, but I found this software from Topaz called Gigapixel AI, and it is magic. I have no idea how it does it, but you put in the dimensions you want. It takes quite a bit of computer processing power and time to do it, but it churns out this high resolution image of absolutely remarkable quality. So I don't sweat the fact that the sensor is 20 megapixels. If I need something big, I know there are options that if it needs to go big, I can make it big. On the Olympus question, Olympus are primarily a medical company. So if anybody has ever had a camera scope examination, it would have been Olympus equipment, and they decided last year to sell off the camera and audio division. So that company has now become, when you click onto it, OM Digital Solutions, Things haven't really changed. This is still the UK page, and they will continue to produce products. They have some quite ambitious ideas to release some cameras. The Micro Four Thirds format is very strong in Japan. Apparently, this man in a speech recently, or in a statement recently, said that it has the highest sales by bayonet in Japan. I'm not sure how he kind of come up with that, but basically they see a future in it, and I think they will support it. Panasonic equally are supporting continued growth, even though they also have a full frame line now. And there's other manufacturers like Blackmagic, which will make them strong, which will keep the format strong in, I think, in the video world. So I think there's certainly plenty in it. I wouldn't have any hesitation in dabbling in it. For many, that might be getting, you know, one body, one lens, one housing, and just seeing how you go. To try it out. It's really nice for kind of free diving is really nice. You know, if you like having a smaller rig. I know Alex Mustard, I don't know if Alex is on. Alex uses them alongside his full frame work. So I found it great, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you might have, and I hope that has kind of opened something of a door to you on that.
John, we've got a question from Dan and Jay Ship. It says, John, each time you upgrade your Olympus camera, do you also need to upgrade your housing?
Yes. So I've only had two. I've had the original Olympus EM1 Mark I, and of course, as you know, if they move one button in the new camera, that means we need a new housing.
Yeah. So
the ergonomics and were different on the new one. So yes is the answer.
Yes. Okay. He says thanks very much, and then he says bugger. Yeah. So I've got a friend who has ditched his. I think it was a D4. 2 D4s with big lenses and this, that, and the other. And he's gone for the similar sort of kind of style camera. And he's very now, you know, he's like saying you've got, you know, a third of the size, a third of the weight. They're not as imposing. He does basically street photography, not as imposing as SLRs. And he would not go back to, I think, the SLR format now. I mean, what we were discussing, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, was to say, you know, gravity as we get older doesn't do us any favors, and you stand up with all your gear on, and then you slap an SLR camera with strobes, and it becomes heavier as you get older, doesn't it, really? And it makes absolute sense to have something smaller. I mean, you know, whatever system that you have, you know, you get used to it and you use it to the best effect. But, you know, the weight actually, I think, is a problem. But the problem, as we were discussing, is that, you know, at what stage do you actually jump from, you know, one system to the other? Because if you spent so much money on an SLR such a kind of setup, and the other thing for me was to say, you know, it's big and beautiful, isn't it? Because you've got buttons and you know where the buttons are, and you can kind of operate them in, you know, with gloves on and this, that, and the other. But that's a prejudice, I think, in me, because you were saying that you feel the cold quite badly and you have thick gloves, and that you don't have a problem actually changing shutter and aperture and this, that, and the other.
No, the housings are fine that way. Yeah. It's more housing design, really.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, to be honest, we don't use half the buttons that, you know, are on the housing. We like to have access to everything, but there's really very little we need to use while we're underwater.
Well, the cameras are so advanced now, like we were saying, is that, say, you know, like you've got 20 megapixels. My D90 is, I think, 12. It's about 15 years out of date. But the gigapixel thing, I think, is something I'll look at. If I was to ever sort of print some of my pictures. But you know, you've got the kind of capacity there. Do you need a 45 megapixel camera? I don't know. So we've got a few more questions coming in. Kirsty is saying, have you considered full frame mirrorless? And is the camera battery life an issue when you take pictures? I suppose the battery would be smaller than an SLR, wouldn't it?
And that was, I think, an issue in the early bodies because they were so small. But as like the EM1 models in particular would be what would be considered, Olympus would consider them their flagship cameras. So they're aiming them at pros who want to downsize, and they did get the battery life much better. So it's quite a large, chunky battery in the EM1. It's a smaller battery in the other bodies, and they're absolutely all-day batteries.
Okay.
Never an issue. Yeah.
And Yazid's got a question. Says, do you prefer using a magnifying viewfinder or the LCD on the back? And I suppose you've got the 180, haven't you, on the Nauticam? So
I do. I prefer the 180, and I'll definitely use it for macro.
Yeah.
And I'll use it if I'm using the water contact optic. It's really good because you can kind of, I suppose, be a little bit more picky, but I will take it off typically for the fisheye, because you don't need to be as kind of see as in as great detail, because it's a very small image either way. So
it sounds like you've got a lot more, well, dare I say, a lot more built-in flexibility. If you can actually change a lens and you can go from wide angle to macro with one lens on.
It's huge. I mean, that's kind of always been a utopian idea of being able to do what landscape photographers do, change a lens if you feel like it. We've never had that. It's the decision on the boat where wider macro, what's it going to be, because you're committed then. And even though you have the option to change, it is better to, I think, in your mind, to have decided what you're sketching in your mind in terms of images. I can't think in macro and wide at the same time, but you may just find something and you say, wow, that's something. And having that, I suppose, flexibility to be able to move from one to the other is really great. Yeah.
We've got a question from Jeremy Brown from Scotland. Thoughts on the depth of field advantage of micro four thirds over full frame for wide angle macro?
I've never really got into, I suppose, analyzing it to that extent. It is an issue if you're using a rectilinear lens behind dome. So you have to stop the lens down to f8 at least. Other than that, once we're, I suppose, more than half a meter away and we focus astutely on what we want, we'll generally get things in focus. It's really the corners are the issue in domes, in rectilinear lenses. The water contact optic makes that problem go away. Yeah.
And another one from Yazid, who says, what about the autofocus? Which modes do you tend to use most?
I just, for the majority of the time, I use single autofocus, and I focus with my thumb on the back. So I turn off autofocus from the shutter. So you focus with your thumb, you let it go, and then you shoot with your front fingers, depending on, I suppose, the housing you're using. So I've always done that with my Subals. I've done it for a long time. I think separating one from the other just makes it easier underwater. You do the focusing thing and then get on with the rest.
Okay. Paul's got a question, not about micro four thirds, but about your books. He says he loved Emerald Seas and was intrigued by your concept book. Can you tell us a little more about that book, please?
I can. So Shortcut came about from a winter a few years ago where we were snowed in, and I had to make my way to work on foot. And I realized the way I made my way on foot was completely different to how we drive. And it just opened this inquiry of, I would have done anything to find even a few yards shorter to get there. And obviously the way we make our way on foot was completely different. So I basically started shooting all of the areas where people walk on foot that were both old and new. So even, for example, a modern housing estate that was built, in less than 10 years, with all the perfectly planned footpaths and lit ways for people to walk and cycle, people still found a way through the back alleys to make their way just to save a few steps. And it was just an interesting kind of rummage around an old town, exploring both the ideas of why we make shortcuts in our heads and I suppose a visual messing around with some black and white film and digital. So it was a fun thing to do.
Having said that, on a personal note, I used to find when I used to kind of go back to the tube station from my place of work, I could have gone via a straight route as the crow flies, but I always ended up going 3 times longer by this pub, this pub, this pub, this pub, this pub on the way home. So, but that's just
That's the
me.
scenic road home, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, the road to ruin. A question from Trevor. John, do you prefer the type WWLC over type or tie WWWL1 and using a different kit lens? Have you got any thoughts? And I don't know what he means by that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I have the WWLC, which is the newer, more compact lens with the buoyancy collar built in, and that uses the 12mm wide end, so that'll be the 24mm equivalent. So I have a Panasonic 12-32 and the WWLC. It's neater and it's really sharp, and it's the best one that I found of using the two. I have used the WWL1, and they've now brought out a version B of that, which builds in the buoyancy collar, but that starts at the 14mm or 28 equivalent. So certainly if I was starting from scratch, I would say the WWLC is the better choice right now.
There you go, Trevor, you've met your match. A question from Laura and Mark. Have you experimented with live composite underwater?
Not underwater. I have on land. It's terrific for low light landscape, or if you're using ND filters for long exposure where you're trying to make smooth water out, or get clouds moving using 6-stop, 10-stop neutral density. It is fantastic for that. But I haven't ever used it underwater. No. Interesting idea. Basically, for anybody who doesn't know, what this does is for long exposures, the image is built as it's captured on the LCD screen on the back. So when you set your bulb and you open the shutter and it starts, there's no light, then you have both the histogram and the image start to show. It's almost like being in the darkroom and watching the print emerge in the developer tray, and that you can start to see the exposure as it's building and then cut off as you see the histogram move across. It's a really neat feature. Yeah.
You've then got the raw file intact, haven't you, I suppose? Yeah.
Yeah. So you're seeing it, you're seeing the file being written essentially. Yeah, it's a great idea.
I mean, for myself, I used to enjoy doing street photography when I lived in London. But with a D90, I mean, you look like the paparazzi, so There's a middle-aged fat bloke basically looking behind his camera with his forehead crinkled up like this. And of course, everyone starts to look down, thinks, weirdo. But the new, the breeder cameras that you're talking about, I think are a lot less imposing on the streets. And certainly, if I was to buy something for street photography, it would be a camera. A 4/3 camera probably, but I don't know which one I would actually kind of buy to actually then be able to take it underwater in the future if I wanted to. So I wouldn't even know where to start, So obviously Nikon is something I know, something about, but the
and that is another consideration, that if you change camera systems, I likened it to kind of changing language. That you've gotten used to Nikon speak in all of your menus and what they term different things. You change that to Olympus or Sony or everybody else, you've got to learn their menu system, their language, and find your way around what is, all of these cameras are so customizable now that you can get yourself in quite a muddle in a really short time. So learning that system and all of those custom settings initially is a head melt no matter what. But once you've kind of nailed it, then it's just your new way of doing it. We tend to resist change anyway, but once you kind of overcome that, it doesn't get in the way.
Sure.
Somebody did ask earlier on and didn't answer it. Have I considered full frame mirrorless? And yes, they sound amazing. The Sony cameras sound really remarkable. I haven't used them, especially the one they announced last week or the week before. It sounds like if if Carlsberg were inventing a DSLR, that would be it for sports, for landscape, for everything, video. The downside would be, while you would have a slightly smaller body, all of the lenses, ports, all of the other kind of optical problems would stay the same. So you'll find it tricky unless you went the water contact optic route to kind of change, but I'm sure they are absolutely remarkable. But I'm really happy with the system I have now. I don't feel a need to kind of go any further really with it. I like the fact that it's neat when I travel, it's neat when I'm on a dive boat, it's tidy for kind of just, and it does what I need it to do. So it's a fit.
I suppose also, you know, because you've been doing it for so long, it's absolutely light years away from where you started, isn't it? You know, so you know, you started with a relative handicap, didn't you? With you know, the film era, Nikonos and this, that, and the other. And now it's almost like you've got everything, I suppose, haven't you? You would know it's not, say, the most technologically advanced bit of kit, but Simon Dean's got a question. How far can you push the ISO comfortably?
Good question. And it is one that again, the you know, full frame cameras definitely have an advantage over a smaller sensor camera when it comes to high ISO. I don't think to use it an awful lot. I would comfortably go to 1600, but I think it starts to fall apart beyond that. You know, they claim that it'll go up much more, but really, you know, you're going to have to do a lot of noise cleanup, I think, if you push it beyond 1600. It's clean and usable without too much fooling around up to that. Whereas, you know, full frame will go much higher, but I don't tend to use high ISO underwater. It is nice to be able to brighten, you know, water background, but then, you know, you're having to turn your strobes down so low that sometimes you can't get them low enough or back far enough. So I don't tend to use high ISO. I think in general sense, even wreck diving here, I think kind of 800 to 1000 is as much as I would generally go.
Great. Has anyone got any more questions for John? Mike Clark has arrived. John, I've got no further questions. So thank you very much for giving and imparting of your knowledge and your time again. So
my pleasure.